Good evening, Sri here.
Hello.
Hello.
Lydia, hello, Sri.
Hi.
So without further ado, some of you might have had a chance to listen to a conversation that I had with Greg at the center. And I know the connection sometimes was not perfect, but I think overall the gravity of the discussion and kind of breadth of topics that we've covered came through, hopefully. And we're looking forward to your reactions or any comments. And if you have any questions at all about these discussions and topics that were raised, please do free to connect with Greg on his email. Which one do you prefer, Grisha, if you repeat?
My email, you could use Greg at intercoin.org.
Intercoin.org. Well, that's your crypto enterprise.
That's right.
Okay, but today this is the class, Greg. As I told you, this is the class in the risk management program. And recently, unfortunately, we could only spend 2 full sessions on cybersecurity issues. And what I've promised Susan, Lydia, and Sri is that we could have another discussion on cybersecurity from entrepreneurial standpoint, right? From somebody who is in charge of number of internet initiatives, including apps and group apps. Okay.
Sure.
And what I wanted to do is ask you some questions, and hopefully we'll entertain some of the ideas for our students. So my first question is, in your experience, how often are apps used by businesses, organizations, including non-for-profits and government? Because I think that there is a general perception that the apps are not proliferating that much within formal organizations, right? That they're mostly retail product. But I know that also a lot of apps were recently used by many different businesses, particularly during elections, for example, particularly creating political campaigns. So it's governmental organizations, non-for-profit organizations, but perhaps you can talk about some private businesses engaged in apps and how.
Well, I mean, apps is a very broad term. Obviously, you know, we're talking about applications of technology. So app is short for application. And when you're applying technology in all kinds of fields, typically it's very hard to secure everything. There's usually in the security community the idea that you can't really know you can't really know what every attack vector will be in advance. So you may secure 9 of them, and then the 10th one will appear. There's also something called the trusted computing base, which essentially means that you trust your operating system, your hardware from Apple or Google. And if they decide to do something like pretend that you voted for this person versus that person on your phone, they have a, you know, or read your bank account, they can probably get that done. So besides that, I just want to say that technology is used all over the place, and we see kind of leaks all the way, including in government, including in enterprise. In fact, we saw a leak of voter databases. In the United States a few years ago, they voted, the entire database was put on Amazon. Somehow all that information was in one place. And so we know what affiliation people had, Democrat, Republican, or whatever they did. Another one is in Israel, they had the entire, pretty much every adult in Israel got their information leaked. The Likud party or database somehow got leaked. Usually it's a fault of a contractor or a subcontractor. So the idea is all the data is in one place. And yes, it is being used in government. And yes, you know, just recently, just a month ago in Brazil, I think it was in Brazil, it leaked the medical records. Hospitals and medical records were leaked of like 100 million people or something of that nature. It's just, you know, when you collect the data, you can expect something might go wrong or someone might hack in, basically.
Let me try. So I know that Susan, Sri, and Lydia would probably have some questions to you. Let me try to link it directly with idea of apps development, right? Because and the reason I know apps are applications, by the same token, you can say Microsoft is an application, Safari is an application. We understand that. And we've actually looked over 2 sessions at multiple different type of breaches that occur. And we analyzed specific cases on cybersecurity in large corporations. But in my mind, and somehow I might be wrong because I'm totally not a professional, but in my mind, there is a difference in perception of particularly apps, the one you can kind of download on your Android or you can download on your iPhone, for example, and a sort of solid, large applications supported by massive specialized technology companies, right? And the concern is perhaps that, first of all, with big companies, with big technology companies, with Apple, with Microsoft, with Cisco, et cetera, you have a standard database of, zero problems, right? You have standard database of something that needs to be patched. You've got regular updates. You've got sort of security protocols that are quite common to the industry. And a lot of different users, particular professional users, can relate to that. Is there the same process in all these myriads and thousands of apps? Some of them are very useful for business, used by political parties and campaigns, used in private businesses, used in personal communications of employees.
Well, I mean, let me share my screen to kind of show you the wide range of things just from this year that took place exactly in the types of companies that you talk about. Certainly, when you have more processes, you catch more bugs. In an open source project, often the source is visible to everybody. So it's actually easier in some way to find flaws, but then also the flaws are found over time. More flaws are found, like Linux and so on, BSD and other open source operating systems. And there's an expression: with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow, which means that there's no deep bug because everyone can sort of figure it out, and you can solve more bugs that way. When you don't know the source, you have essentially something called security by obscurity. So it's harder to understand how the system works. But people who do understand and spend the time may actually have 0-day exploits. So 0-day means there's been 0 days and people knew about it and it's been deployed. One such example is Microsoft. Literally just this month, 10th of March, right? Microsoft Exchange, huge exploit. So many companies use Microsoft Exchange. Of course, the more companies and enterprises use a solution, the more they demand there be security in place. Especially government should demand that of their contractors. But as we've seen from the trade winds, for example, that's been used everywhere, sometimes that very trust means that once you compromise, say Microsoft Exchange in this case, you're going to get a lot of organizations compromised at once. You can go into the mall and have a vector of attack. And by the way, the biggest type of attack is usually it's called arbitrary command execution, that you can execute any command on the operating system, let's say as a root user. And sometimes there's even something called a rootkit, which installs it in ring 0, which is essentially the operating system runs in a privileged space. And if you can get in there, sometimes even antivirus can't get you out. So those are pretty rare. But the idea that we trust this trusted computing base from Microsoft, from Apple, sometimes it does get compromised as well, but certainly less than some fly-by-night developer or a small startup. They're probably much more likely, but also people trust them less with the data that they entrust to their apps.
So the concern I think that we have, and we've observed that, is we've learned about bring your own disaster problem, for example, right? Meaning that people often use their personal devices, small devices like iPads and iPhones, when they do their regular work. And that a lot of connectivity is discovered within the applications that unwillingly happen to be collocated, so to speak, and very close to the professional cybersecurity toolkit that doesn't actually cover them, right?
Yeah, I mean, just the other day, just to tell you a bit about my personal life, I was on a date. We went on a date to a place where there was a comedian performing. And the next day, my date texts me and says, look, what got suggested on my Facebook feed. It's that same comedian performing a video somewhere else. And so I said, well, it's probably because he checked into the same place that your phone checked in. And then it turns out Facebook uses your location data anytime it wants when you give it permission. So it uses, see, these companies also have a commercial interest to do this. It's not even hacking, it's just that they have a very, very permissive license from you. Basically says, give us access to your camera, give us access to your location, and then we will help you to do these things. Look at cats, let's see. And so as a result, you do this once, and often it keeps having that information. So Apple is very much on the side of the privacy. They're trying to shut down, for example, third-party cookies that track you as you go from website to website. Facebook became so upset by this, they actually went to war with Apple in the court of public opinion, took out articles in various newspapers about how Apple is destroying a very good business model that helps personalize ads to people. Now, I'm sure some people sympathize with that, but Facebook doesn't have that many people sympathizing with it, given its track record. So basically, these corporations are also interested in your data, and sometimes they will take it by hook or by crook. So yeah, if you leave your location on, and even if you don't, there's a nice video with Edward Snowden and talks about how your phone has the IMEI number, or has a MAC address, MAC, which it essentially blasts to every Wi-Fi hotspot as you drive by. It's connecting here, it's connecting there, it's connecting to cell phone towers, it's connecting to stingrays that police have set up. So your phone has basically got an identifier which can be used to track you very easily. And whoever sets up Wi-Fi might actually be able to find out you've been nearby, something like that. If your phone's set up to connect to Wi-Fi, but it's certainly set up to connect to cell phone towers whenever you turn it on, the radios. So that's just a glimpse of like your personal data and how much you're revealing to everyone around you, basically.
Okay, well, I think we are aware of some of these. Tell me how much attention you think is there within sort of smaller app development community to cybersecurity in general, and specifically for their apps.
Well, it's very hard as a small app developer to secure everything. I should know. I run a small, app development company. Usually, you want to take in as the less data that you take in, the less liability you have. And now with the laws from the European Union and California and other places like GDPR, basically almost make data a liability for any registered business. It's not anonymous, and that's the only kind of business that can put apps in the App Store. There are certainly businesses that can make a website on the open web, and you have to watch out sometimes of what you share with just random websites. But Apple and others tend to vet the apps, which is at least basic minimal, standards. And one of the standards is the fact that you have an address, that you're registered in a country, you have a Dun and Bradstreet number or something. So those kinds of businesses, the regulators can find, and they can fine them for storing data that they shouldn't, that they don't have a real need to store. So I think with the regulators clamping down, data becomes almost a liability. And so businesses are now shifting to store less of it rather than more of it. And that's what I like to see. End-to-end encryption is almost the end game of that. End-to-end encryption is when you store the data all on your client's devices under your control. And whenever it's sent out, it's encrypted first. So no other computers have the keys. And so essentially connecting, giving permissions to a friend or adding a friend actually becomes sharing a key, an encryption key to this or that data. So that's essentially where everything's going. But for the time being, we do trust Facebook, LinkedIn, we trust GitHub, for example, to store the code, to index the code, and to help us search and find things and collaborate. But really, GitHub doesn't need to exist because you could have Git, which is a program that runs on your computer, and you can encrypt traffic end to end. So at the end of the day, you can have some encrypted, end-to-end encrypted solutions. But until that happens, the governments are essentially making it costly to store data, just like they have been with PCI compliance for credit card data, for example, and other things. They require you to have procedures in place, and that creates a sort of liability when you start storing what is called personally identifiable information, or PII, information that can be used to identify an individual. And there's degrees of that. So the more of that you store, the more procedures you have to have in place.
Can you give us few real life examples of smaller apps creating massive sort of havoc in terms of cybersecurity breaches?
Smaller apps. The thing is, the smaller the app, the less the breach, because less people are using it. Sometimes, however, so the large ones are actually a lot, make the headlines, right? Here's one: almost all Brazilians get their health information exposed. Or Yahoo breaches 3 billion accounts, all of them compromised.
Yeah.
Equifax 2017, nearly all US households, right? 2020, like I was talking about, the Likud party idea of names, addresses of all Israeli adults. So by not having all the data in one place, there are going to be lots of small breaches. And that's not necessarily better. For example, this blog is hosted on WordPress, and it's a wide variety of hosting companies and other things that you have to secure. It's obviously easier to secure one architecture, one data center in one place, right, than it is to secure everything everywhere. So it's not necessarily more secure to have open source software running on commodity hosting. It's less about security, it's more about freedom. It's more about choice and price and power dynamics. But to answer your question, I'm sure there are a lot of small apps that are constantly hacked, or perhaps they're not hacked. Perhaps the developer of the app simply wants to get their information. For example, Mark Zuckerberg was a developer of Facebook, right? And what did he do? Well, this is what he said back in back before he really got going with Facebook. This was his attitude before he got funded. He's talking on a chat, and the conversation was like this. Zuck says, so if you need info about anyone at Harvard, just ask. I have 4,000 emails, pictures, addresses, SNS, I'm guessing social security numbers? I doubt it. I don't know what this is. It's too long ago. He said, what? How did you manage that one? People just submitted it. I don't know why. They trust me, right?
Yeah.
So he also did this. Check this out. He was being investigated by the Harvard Crimson. Okay, they were doing an article on him, 2004. He broke into their private email account. How did he do it? Well, the person reused the same password on Facebook that they were using on their email account. And Mark Zuckerberg, being a nice guy that he was back then, I guess, or, he was personally a lot at stake for him, he decided that he was going to store the passwords that were entered into his Facebook form. And he used them to go into the email of the person. Okay, he was 19 at the time. And so basically he wanted to know what they had been writing about him. So he did that. I'm not sure how they found out, or maybe he confessed to it. But this is an example of a small app at the time.
At the time, yeah. So that brings us to your personal. Maybe we'll conclude and then leave one or two, three questions basically. What about Cubics? So Cubics is an application for groups connectivity, for social connections. It's different from Facebook, obviously, in the open architecture way. How do you personally look at risk management of cybersecurity for yourself, like for groups? Let me ask you for the record, have you ever been hacked, to your knowledge?
Okay, great question. Before I answer that, I just want to make a small correction. Mark Zuckerberg didn't store the passwords to, at least it's not clear that he did. Instead, what he did is he examined a log of failed logins to see if any of the Crimson members ever entered an incorrect password. Okay, so maybe you go to the site.
I'd say it's even better. You find the correct password by examining incorrect submissions to your site.
Exactly.
You could see he was intelligent. You could see that he was very intelligent.
Absolutely intelligent. But look, if you're trying to get into someone's account, you definitely think, oh, maybe they tried to reuse their password. You try anything, right? And the thing is, very important is that the logging on your site can reveal a lot of the things that you later redact from your database. That's an example. So the logs that are of errors, failed things, etc., may actually reveal sensitive information, and that's a good example of that.
That's a great point.
Yep. One last thing I want to say before I do that, there's a nice comic called XKCD, which makes fun of a lot of things, including computer security, mathematics, physics, and so on. It's created by this guy, Randall Munro. He is essentially, romance, sarcasm, math, and language, he says. All these things, he's been doing this for years. So the one I'd like to show you is, okay. XKCD, right? There's all these good ones, but XKCD, and then it's going to be, let's see if I can find this really quickly. Oh, I remember. Here we go. Password reuse. Yeah. Okay, he just basically says, set up a web service to do something simple, like image hosting or just cats or whatever. Bam, you got a few million emails, default usernames, and passwords. Tons of people use 1Password, strong or not, for most accounts. Use the list and some proxies to try automated logins to the 20 or 30 most popular sites, plus banks and PayPal. We've got now a few 100,000 real identities on a few dozen servers, and nobody suspects anything. And then what? Well, that's why I got stuck. What do I do with it? I could probably net a lot of money one way or the other if I did things carefully, but research shows money doesn't make people happier. Once they make enough, so yeah.
Okay.
You get the point.
Yes.
It's too easy, and that's the problem, right? People enter their information and they reuse passwords. All right. So your question was, did we ever get hacked? Well, it's hard to say, because a lot of the times the hacks wouldn't leave a trace.
Reveal themselves. Yeah.
Right. One time I do remember getting hacked on my way to the airport 2 hours before I was going to go to the airport to fly to Europe. It turned out that my phone, let's say 3 hours, my phone, just the connection dropped, like the SMS. I couldn't send SMS and so on. So I thought, okay, what did someone not pay the bill? What's happening? So we have a family plan. I called my parents, I asked, everything was fine. It turns out I was something called SIM swapped or SIM hijacked or something like that. Basically, somebody called into AT&T and was able to convince them that it's me or, someone on the family plan. They hijacked the SIM card. So it's not that I don't get texts. That's the least of my problems. They were going to get all the SMS routed to their phone. So they have a SIM card, and they convinced AT&T to transfer the number to that phone, to that SIM card. Okay. So now what can they do with it? Well, SMS is used as a second factor to remind yourself of the password on many different sites, right? So first thing what I did was I was trying to make sure that, I called AT&T, got it back. But then you have to think where is your phone used and all those things. I was also worried that they would get into the email, but it turns out my email is much harder to get into on Gmail. Because first of all, there isn't a Google representative that can be fooled. And secondly, Google Google has security where they don't just reveal your email unless you already have a cookie on your computer that, that says you've been there before, etc. If you're a totally new person, it emails your other accounts first. So I would have known. But they did something very clever. They went to GoDaddy, and since my email is hosted at cubix.com, intercoin.com or org, it's not hosted at gmail.com. So what they did is they went into my GoDaddy and they convinced the people at GoDaddy that they should get into this account. Once they did that, they actually started porting my domain name, cubix.com of the company, to their servers. And I was tipped off to this because I got some emails with just a subject line, test. Test. So they were testing when finally the emails would be delivered to their server. So I had to go and set up a second factor on GoDaddy. So this is, as I'm going to the airport, before I go, I was happy to have fixed that vector. So what happens is they port your domain name and now they get your email. Well, guess what your email has? All of the bank information. That would have been a mother load, right? Because a lot of the banks forgot password, goes to your email. Oh, it's me. It's not really you anymore. So the second factor is really important. And the second factor should not be SMS. In fact, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, recommends that we do not use SMS anymore as the second factor. So second factor, SMS. They announced maybe a couple of years ago that NIST SMS deprecation. So they walked it back a little bit because apparently people were upset, but they're absolutely right. The National Institute published a blog explaining its guidance for deprecation of SMS as a viable second factor. Because clearly you can fool AT&T people, apparently. What you should be using is someone that you can't fool, which is all these authenticators that I have here on my phone. I have Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, Authy, and another thing called Authenticator from 1Password.
What is the difference, just for the sake of those who don't know? Because I don't know.
Oh, they're all the same. It's just from different companies.
No, what's the difference between Authenticator used this way and the SMS dual factor verification?
Well, I guess I can show you this. It basically shows this. This is my authenticator for GoDaddy. It shows that little 6-digit number.
That's a real dual factor. Yeah, okay, you get the code.
Okay. So obviously you can use those little dongles, but now your phone is good enough. For these authenticators, all you have to do is trust Google to not create a backdoor for their own employees, right? And then you, and only you, have access to the data. And that brings me back to my point. End-to-end encryption is all about making client-side data. So if you go to Google, whatever, cubix.com blog, you can read on our blog things like building client-first apps, the case for building client-first web apps. So again, it's very important that if you think that the client is hosting their data on their own device, and your website doesn't need any of that data, it just needs to provide more resources and materials publicly for all kinds of sites and privately for logged in users. But you don't need the data. You can have a cookie on the website which identifies the user uniquely. This usually is called the session cookie. So you've got, here's a session ID, and our framework is just some number. and that's all you get. If you want more information, you have to have a good reason to store it. That's basically the one other thing I want to say about this really quickly. If you want to display the user's name back to them on your site, or if you want to display the user's friends to them, you do not need to store this information or get this information. There's something called an iframe. And back in a long time ago, we actually made a patent, which we never, a patent application, which we never actually made into a patent. This was literally 2012, about how to personalize websites privately without any storing of information. All you do is you create an iframe, and the content of that iframe is hosted by the person's own operating system.
On device, yeah.
Exactly. So it intercepts the request and serves up their own whatever you want, name, friends, but it serves it up from the device itself. So actually displaying the person's name back to them is not a valid reason to get their name and store it. There's actually, once you eliminate those, there's very few reasons that you really need a person's name, even a username or anything besides a random user ID. And so sites can literally just become sites which use the user ID and tell the operating system to display everything else from the user's own device. That would be ideal. And I think eventually that's what's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Now a site simply asks you for their real name. And in fact, Facebook and Google had a real names policy, which in my opinion is ridiculous. Real names policy caused a lot of controversy, especially for people who are transgender, or maybe people who are like in Iran or something like that, dissidents who may not. Actually, it's funny, I mentioned Iran, but actually Iran has a big pro-transgender policy. They do the most transgender surgeries in the world, but that's a separate topic. My point being that there are people who want to hide their names for one reason or another, and yet engage in online discussion. This is like totally the opposite of, of privacy. This is revealing your real name, your location, sexual preferences, who you've dated, pretty much everything. And then you trust Facebook to keep that information. So obviously they've done a really good job, Facebook. I haven't really heard much of the leaks except for Cambridge Analytica, obviously, which voluntarily gave this information to third parties. But my point being that particular examples are not what's important. Principles are. And one principle is that you should not have your private keys ever leave your device. Programs should not be sending private keys unencrypted to any network server anywhere. And similarly, we're going to have your name, relationship status, and everything else become private information that's encrypted with private keys, and sometimes encrypted with keys that you share with other people. And when that happens, you're going to have an address book, that's like the one we have in groups, like the Groups app, and you're going to be friending people. You're going to be sharing with them some information, but not other information. And all these decisions are going to be made by you, and they're going to be enforced by cryptography and not by trusting third parties like Facebook.
So, yeah. Okay. I know you are in a relative hurry, so maybe we'll just leave room for one or two questions.
Absolutely. Sure.
I had a quick question. So it sounds like we have the technology to have end-to-end data encryption, and risk mitigation would say that companies should dump the data and encrypt it as well. But since this interrupts their revenue through like data sales, how do consumers take control of their data and privacy when opting out of these apps really isn't an option? Or, I no longer have a Facebook, but I still have an Instagram. They're owned by the same company, so I'm not really, I'm just stopping giving them additional data, but at least on the Facebook platform. But how do we take more control over this when the tools are there, but they're not being utilized?
Right. That's a very good question. And, people think they're doing something when they're moving from one platform to another. Like here, just a few months ago, a lot of people moved from WhatsApp because of their policy, which people, I think, read correctly, that they're going to use your data in ways that you might not want. And eventually they moved to do something like this. So they moved to Telegram, which I would say is a strong, and Signal, which is run by two anarchists, essentially anarchist-minded people, libertarian-minded people, who want to secure your conversations and make them private. I'm going to say there's two things. One is there are real societal trade-offs between end-to-end encryption and privacy on the one hand, and safety and accountability on the other hand. If everyone is always having private conversations, all you have is metadata, who is talking to whom and so forth, how frequently. And sometimes you don't even have that, because the metadata may itself be obfuscated through, networks that are not
Well, the
real.
encryption layers, yeah.
Exactly. So what you're basically dealing with is a lot of the people in the FBI and National Security Agency and others tasked with trying to keep people safe. They want as much firepower as they can, as many tools as they can. And of course, they would want as much as possible, which is to say, read everybody's information all times. And in fact, Snowden revealed that they were doing exactly this, with a big fat pipe coming out of these corporations. Because you only have that big database and you have to get in there. Sometimes they give what's called a national security letter, an NSL letter, which comes with a gag order, and you can't tell anyone that you got the letter, but you actually get, you have to hand over all this information. So they either do it by hacking you, as they did with Prism, whatever, which Snowden showed, or they do it through just calling up these corporations and saying, look, we know you have the data, please give it to us, and we will try to find any threats. Now, look, it's very easy. It's going to be very easy to have pervasive AI. I mean, literally, just the other day, of satellites can see you everywhere. I don't know. There's a story basically of satellites now can watch you everywhere all the time. And of course, you don't need satellites. You have cameras all over the place, small cameras. If those databases are all linked, you can have an AI pretty much figure out where you've been. It can also figure out emerging patterns of a movement and people visiting each other and planning something. It can figure out things, but of course, on the one hand, you have dissidents who are peaceful. On the other hand, you may have terrorists who are planning a terror attack. And so it's very hard to say what a society would have if you went back to just end-to-end encryption, because then they would need a mole in every organization. And that's how people used to operate in the past. Here in the United States, you have the McCarthy era, where they were bugging the communists or the socialists. In the USSR, they had the KGB, where they were bugging people who were against their whatever their government was, religions or whatever. So governments tend to place law enforcement agencies like Hoover's FBI would place, listening devices and moles, etc. Today, they don't need to do that because they can just read your data. But we've said that you cannot spy on your own citizens. One of the things about the spy agencies is that they should be spying on others. One last thing I want to say about that is the Five Eyes, however, is an arrangement of friendly countries, alliance between the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course, their spy agencies can spy on our citizens, and our spy agencies can spy on their citizens. So by linking those databases together, you can circumvent pretty much any restriction on spying on your own citizens. You just ask the other country to give you whatever information you need. So much for the national security apparatus. Your question was more about the commercial, right, applications of it. And funny enough, the advertisers are, in a way, they're also interested in the same things. So back, years ago, I wrote this, the genie's out of the bottle. Welcome to the big data revolution. And what it talked about is that essentially the big data is all about putting all the data in one place. And the idea, I wrote this like literally 7 years ago, is that it's not just the NSA that wants your data, it's everybody. And fighting this is a losing battle. So it's interesting because big data is like crack cocaine to these organizations. And, and it's worse than crack cocaine because with crack, there's no competition competing to get more crack. But with big data, if you don't have the big data, right, then you're at a disadvantage to the other ones that do have the big data. So you almost like cannot not have a service that like puts, these unfair advantages in there, or so they think. And I'll get to really quickly the different other business models where you don't need to vacuum up people's data. They've just been kind of lazy and externalizing the cost to society by doing this, because it's like easy, hey, why not take everyone's data if you can get away with it, which Facebook does all the time. They take it, they get caught, they apologize, they say they won't do it again, and sometimes they do exactly, they continue to do that thing. Sometimes they do other things. Google has now put out this thing called Flock, which is essentially a way to say, okay, Apple's third-party cookies, we are not going to do third-party cookies. We're going to ban third-party cookies with Chrome as well. But we're going to basically do statistical analysis on certain other things and put you in cohorts of what you're likely to buy, or things like that. So essentially, that's what Google is doing. Why are they all doing it? Google said they're not going to be evil. So is this evil? So Eric Schmidt said, we're going to go right up to the line, but not cross it. Who decides where the line is? So essentially, I make this joke that, you know how you call people users, right? The users. So drug users also, customers of drugs are called users. These corporations.
There are a few people, yeah, I've read that part of your paper somewhere, article somewhere, where there are very few actually customers that are called users, right? If you think about it.
Exactly. I mean, in this case, I would say the corporation is the user and the data is the crack, right? So you really want, you can't get off of it, the data crack pipe. But here are some ways you can get off. First, the large government, the European Union and other governments might put the ban hammer down, make it costly for you to store data. So now you need compliance, or now you need, you might be hit with a very costly thing that might kill your company, right? That's one. I'm a more libertarian-minded person, if you've seen any of my videos. So I believe that we should have end-to-end encryption through open source software. I believe that if there's anything we want to accomplish as an alternative to big tech, we need to step up as society and put up some money, time, and collaborate and create open source software, like we've done with Linux, web browsers, web servers, WordPress, and tons of other things. We need to create open source software that's going to be as good as the proprietary software. And then there is no profit motive, and people are going to move to it eventually, same way they move to WordPress. Some people are going to stay on the proprietary software, but at least they have a choice. The other answer is that there are so many business models that you don't need people's data for. You just need their intentions. For example, when you go to Google, you're searching for something, and that's an intent. You have, let's say, I search for, I don't know, flying drones, right? I might want to buy a drone. So thank you, Google, for not putting an ad over here. But I'm actually surprised. Usually they would put ads, but this is surprisingly free of ads. I was going to say that this is a great time to let me know that you could buy a drone, right? How about if I to buying a drone? I'm sure they're going to give me some ads, right? Yep, there you go, ads, buying a drone. So each of these represents a user intent. I don't need to know the person's interest. They just told me what they want to do. So that's one thing. And that's what, for example, DuckDuckGo talks about. It says, we don't store your data, but of course, buying a drone, I'm pretty sure they're going to show me some ads. Well,
they do.
Maybe not yet, but eventually I'm sure they will in the future. Oh, here we go. Ads. Yeah. So anyway, my point is, one is just intent. You don't need to get people's information. Just capture their intent by having a search engine for things. At Cubics, the very first thing we did before building all of this is we wanted to build a search engine for your social life. And we wanted to say, what are my friends doing? I want to go out and do something. So we may capture people's interests, but we don't capture their name. So at least it's like all these random nameless IDs have these interests. They've been to these places, right? But at least we don't have their names. Group discounts is a big one. So when you're trying to do something, there's an intent. It's hard to organize an activity. If a site can help you to organize a group activity, then that activity takes place. The merchant can then give a group discount to everybody, and they can give you a cut for helping bring more people to the site. Facebook is not thinking along these lines. And you know, micro payments is another thing where you pay a site with cryptocurrency. It doesn't have to know who you are. It just needs to collect information for serving you content. And something like that, we're also exploring. We have the Cubics ecosystem for digitizing the economics of digitizing media and content. So instead of having these paywalls, you can just come and you can have a micro payment happen from Facebook to New York Times or whatever. And I talked about this last time when I talked about the news media and how they are in a war with Facebook in Australia. So those are some ideas. There's tons of ideas. There's tons of business models, software as a service, e-commerce. You don't need people's information. And with crypto, you might have a future where people won't give you their information. They'll just send you the cryptocurrency. You don't know who they are. But then again, it goes back to the national security question. What if somebody is buying materials to make a bomb? How do you know? So you're going to have the spy agencies be very strong voices in, like the FBI and William Barr and others talking about how we do need a backdoor and we do need keys to everything. So you're going to see that.
Yeah, there was a famous appeal to the Supreme Court, I think, from the Justice Department against Apple after the security incident on the phone, when they wanted to open the phone of the terrorist in California, right?
That's right. That's right. The William Barr Department of Justice.
I don't think it was Barr's Department of Justice. It was before Barr.
It may have been before, but yeah.
But he announced the prosecution. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, it doesn't matter who it was. Every Department of Justice administration under any party is going to be interested in the most tools. Although I would be surprised if they ever put someone, who is a civil libertarian to such an extent that even though they're in that position, they're going to not sacrifice civil liberties for national security. You know the famous Benjamin Franklin quote.
Yeah. Maybe maybe Greg, I know you're past your deadline time. One question, okay? If there is one question.
Sure.
I'll ask. Greg, thank you for taking all this one. But in all the things that you said with respect to the security by obscurity and all things going around with respect to all the digitization, we know we all moved around from a centralized database to a distributed database system, centralized data storing to a distributed data storage systems. With all the things that are currently happening around the world, I know emergence of the blockchain technology is one part where it is pivoting the way for encryption and to anonymize as well. So how much do you think the world is towards using the technology to and still value the privacy and along with the lines of encryption, end-to-end encryption?
What's the end of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, do the use of the blockchain technology at this minute, is that going to prevail? Our governments and organizations are going to be enforced to make use of that one for storing the data, evaluating the transactions, to keep anonymous identities of the people anonymous?
It's a great question. Well, first of all, the blockchain does not make things anonymous. It makes them kind of pseudonymous, which means that often these blockchains are public and you can actually see who sent to whom if you're talking about these public keys or addresses. And so if you can de-anonymize that address, you see what they've done throughout. So in fact, if you talk to a lot of people, you'll find the people on Silk Road who used Bitcoin and so on, you just de-anonymize their address and then you see everything they've ever done with that address. There's a lot of things now that where a Bitcoin wallet creates a new address every time. A Bitcoin wallet software creates a new address, so it's harder to track. You know, you want to create fresh new addresses. But of course, the transactions are still sort of, what you do is you go through a gateway, like you go through, let's say, PayPal or Gemini or one of these exchanges, right? You cash out of it. So you've submitted your KYC or AML, anti-money laundering. So they have your information. They can then track how this sent to that wallet. Well, who is that wallet? So yeah, sometimes the chain breaks, right? Sometimes they send it to a wallet and you just lose track. Like you could create a couple wallets, one's going to be anonymous, and then they lose track from there, right? But they follow the money as they've always have. You know, whenever there's a crime and there's a money, they try to follow who got a lot of money and go work backwards from there. So it's the same old tools. Blockchain does not help prevent that. And there may be a good compromise actually between accountability in society and anonymization. When they need to anonymize you, they do. Maybe they have a warrant, otherwise they don't. That's one thing. But if you really want to be truly anonymous, you look at networks like Freenet or Made Safe, MAIDSAFE, and they're the future. They're also Tor, which is essentially the web, but it goes through onion layers. And the problem with that is it's all hosted from one server. So you take down the server, we find out where it's being served, then you find the person. But these networks that I told you, Freenet, you know, and others, they actually obfuscate everything. And there is no one server anymore, but it's actually being hosted on many different computers. And in the middle, there's like IPFS, Interplanetary File System. And IPFS is essentially voluntarily people decide to pin a file on their computer. Similarly to how on BitTorrent, you seed a movie. When you download it, you also become a seeder because you have the movie. So you are also someone who can seed to others. Made Safe is probably the most secure, the most anonymous network. And it's coming out in 2 years or so, I think. We're looking at it with Intercoin. We're looking to maybe interoperate with it. But at the end of the day, governments, you can't stop technology, but you can observe people in the real world, where they go, what they eat, you know, what they spend their credit card money on, etc. You can't hide with the satellites and the cameras and the ones that can look how your heart beats in infrared, and they can analyze how you walk, and they can look at facial recognition. You're basically, in the real world, if you step outside your building, or even in your building, they can use Wi-Fi through the walls and they can figure out your signature that way. So if you robbed a bank and you had a signature with the Wi-Fi and you show up there with that same signature, they'll know it's you. So it's really like, you can't hide. So, and then anonymity is not something that you want to shoot for in the real world unless you live in the mountains somewhere away from civilization. But you can shoot for it online. And ironically, what we say online may actually be private. So I'll leave it at that.
Online still private. Great.
If
you want.
Yeah. Grisha, thank you very much. I think I know you overstayed a bit, but it was, I think, very, very enlightening. So
thank you. I appreciate it, everybody. And yeah, send me this video. I'd love to post it on. Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.